This may end up being a slightly shorter video than normal, but I suppose that's appropriate given that the Bastion, that is to say Bastion, I keep wanting to say the Bastion. Bastion is in fact a bit shorter than most games I've actually looked at recently. But I actually want to talk about that before I go into anything else. Now, let me make this clear. This game is so relatively short that there is effectively nothing I can really talk about without going into spoilers. So if for whatever reason you have not played Bastion, this is your warning right now. In fact, we'll go and do the thing. No, spoilers. This whole video is going to basically involve spoilers, okay? I'm not going to hold back on this one. No cutoff point like I normally do, okay? Just wanted to get that out there. So, two big things I want to talk about really before we get into the game proper. The first is something that I'll probably do a short discussion of by itself, but it deserves to be mentioned here because this is probably one of the better examples I've seen of this lately. Those of you who've been gaming for the last 30 plus years are aware of a lot of trends in gaming. And it's always funny kind of looking back and seeing how things have changed. But the reason I bring this up specifically is not for nostalgia's sake or anything like that. One of the interesting things about most of the games of both the NES and the SNES era is that statistically speaking, I mean, there were always outliers, but statistically speaking, most of those games were really short, right? If you knew what you were doing, you could beat most NES games in anywhere from a half an hour to an hour. Now, there's much more to be discussed there, and we'll get into that later, but my point is most SNES games averaged anywhere from about an hour to, well, the upper limit is actually pretty high, all things considered, given some of the SNES games. But the point I'm trying to get across here is that that was considered the norm at the time, right? And over time, it became more and more acceptable for a game to it became acceptable in public consciousness as gamers, as a subculture, or as a culture rather, that we want our games to be more enough value for our time. Now again, this is a subject that deserves its own discussion, and it will be getting its own video later. But I bring it up here because Bastion is very short. If you're paying attention, this is actually the second game, or technically the third game, that I've looked at that is very short, that is nevertheless very high quality, and therefore, in my opinion, is deserving of its price tag. And yet that is not a simple issue because, you know, we have to not just budget our money, but our time and how much money we're spending on that time. So the point I'm trying to make here is that it took me 4 hours to go through Bastion the first time. That was pretty much 100%ing stuff. And it took me a lot less time than that. I believe about 2.5 hours to go through on the New Game Plus because I already had the weapon loadout I enjoyed. For those of you curious, musket and calamity gun are my weapons of choice. And the final attack or whatever from the musket for my Q ability. Anyways, the reason I bring this up though is that some people, and many people, are going to look at this and think, a 4-hour game, or if you count the New Game Plus, at most an 8-hour game? Is that really worth the price of admission? Now, I would say yes, but that is from the perspective of the quality on display. One of the things I feel that shorter games like this, like the other two, in case you're wondering, it's Modern Warfare 1 and 2 are the other two games I looked at. They were very short. When you have a game that is very high quality, it is still worth purchasing, even though it is a short game. And the other really big important thing that makes that worth that purchase is if it has replayability. This is something that a lot of games tend to miss out on, and I've noticed in the more modern thing, and it's partially because of that length. This is actually kind of ironic, isn't it? Again, I don't want to get into the full discussion here. I just realized I'm starting to segue into that. So bottom line, all I want to say is the game is pretty short, and that has to be taken into consideration. The other thing I want to talk about before we really get into the game proper is the term indie. For those of you not aware, indie actually does mean something. It means independent developer. Now, that term has had at least 5 definitions I could think of over the course of video gaming as an industry. The most common usage I've heard of it nowadays is literally a determinant of its budget. In other words, even a game that is made not, by a developer that is only technically or only, in a very gray sense, an independent developer, nevertheless is a game that was made with a very small budget, then that game thereby qualifies as an indie game. And I've actually heard some people argue that we should just delineate so that there are only two kinds of games when it comes to production, not production values, but production budgetary requirements, aka the AAA game over here and the indie game over here. In other words, only differentiate by the amount of budget that goes into a game. I only mention this because a lot of people champion Bastion as one of the true big games that really got indie developing its swoon. We've actually pretty much, in my opinion, already gotten over the golden age of indie development. The first golden age, obviously. I guess you could call that the silver age. So the silver age of golden development, of indie development. And now we're in there's loads and loads of crap and a few gems in the rough. And we'll probably have a golden age once all that settles down a bit more. And in case you think I'm just being cynical, that pattern tends to happen for just about every particular era of video gaming, even if that era only lasts a few years. Look at what happened to MMOs, for example. Moving on. This game is without question a low-budget game, and a game that nevertheless was, it was made by a relatively small group of people. Relatively small, compared to like a AAA game. But I'm not sure I could actually call this indie game by that definition, because there's so much honest-to-goodness effort that goes into it, and it got so much publicity and so much thing. I don't know. I'm not trying to split hairs on this. I only mention this because I know some people will fight tooth and nail for the definitions of these games. My actual point is that I don't really care about that definition. What I do care about is the fact that Bastion was an awesome game and helped encourage an entire generation of game developers, both on the individual level and on the company level, to go out and really try some good stuff. So, awesome! That's actually the real point I was trying to reach. Sorry for segueing there. Now, I mentioned something probably a little controversial in the assessment that's going to make you stab my eyes out and then, kill me horribly with sticks, which is very unpleasant, and I would rather you not do that. But if you have to, it's okay. Let me just try and explain myself first. I mentioned that both the gameplay and the story were overall average. And I meant that. The gameplay itself was finicky, not particularly engaging, and ultimately I found myself doing the duck and move thing with the musket pretty much constantly. And it never actually, I never really found it fun. It never really bothered me. Make no mistake. It was never at the point where I was like, oh, I hate playing this game. This was not a Final Fantasy Tactics situation where I was enduring the gameplay I didn't like for the story that I loved. I just never actually found myself engaged in the gameplay. There's a really wonky level of collision detection, especially with some of the floors. The designs are wonderful, don't mistake me, but it got to the point where a lot of them were a little hard to actually figure out where the real floor, the actual ground is. And the character moves so slowly that I found myself literally compelled to be dash running everywhere, which of course added to the problem. And then you add to the fact that most of the time I felt like a complete weakling for all intents and purposes, especially when I actually got up into melee combat. Maybe that's just me, maybe I just suck. But again, none of it was actually bad. The ranged weapons actually worked really well. I enjoyed the timing aspect of both the bow and the thrown weapons that you could toss. I enjoyed the fact that you can have a choice, a tactical choice between, a shotgun, a spray effect, or one specific hit that's going to do a ton of damage, or repeating attack that you can use while not moving. There was a lot of tactical choices in the combat, and the fact that you could switch between any two weapons. It wasn't melee ranged, it was two weapon slots, and you could put whatever you want in both of them. That was a definite plus. So like I said, there's about as much good as bad, which is why I just say it ended up as being average. Let's talk about the story. One more time, because I want to mention this every time, just in case I have a new viewer. Story, plot, characterization, character growth, thematic significance, and setting. I mentioned this one last this time for obvious reason. Plot of Bastion, not exactly bad. I'd say the plot is overall like a 3 on the -10 to 10 scale. It's pretty good, all things considered. It had me interested. I wanted to know what happened next. I was curious how things came about, all that fun stuff. Characterization. The kid was, for a silent protagonist, the kid was actually surprisingly well fleshed out, and you learned a lot in subtle ways, which is a point I'll be making later, about Rusk, about Zia, and about The guy whose name I can't remember. Zulf. I had to write it down. So definitely good characterization. Character growth. This one's a rough one. It could be argued that there is no character growth throughout the game. And it would be hard to argue that. For the most part, the characters we see are the characters that we are presented with. I mean, we learn about their history, and then we learn them as they are now, and then that never really changes. The only one who has any change in their disposition is Zulf, but his character doesn't actually grow in the process. He simply changes his mind, changes it back, and he still retains his same self throughout the whole thing. I'm not making fun, I'm just saying it's not a strong point of the game. Thematic significance. Well, there is a theme, and I'll be talking about that dead last. It's the very final point here. There's only really the one theme. Arguably, there's two themes, but that's getting depressing, so we'll get to that. So all of this so far is still a net positive, but it's overall just kind of especially the plot. I mentioned the plot was like a 3 on the scale. But the problem with the plot, it's, as I'm being too generous to it, to be completely honest with you. If I'm really just breaking it down to its bare bones, the plot is very average. There was a calamity. It was caused by us. We did it to ourselves. There was some politics involved. There were some personal struggles involved. That side, is now trying to stop everything. We can reset it or move on. That's basically the plot. Not much really there. Kind of bare bones, but I saved this for last for a reason, because setting. This is where Bastion really shines. This is what really drags the overall story up significantly. I know the inevitable comparison to Dark Souls is going to come in, so let's just get it out here. Comparison to Dark Souls. Okay, now that we got that out of the way. Bastion has an excellent presentation of its setting. You find out about its setting in item descriptions. You find out about its setting in random things the narrator says. Usually just one line about a specific thing. You find out about setting as you're progressing through, and he'll talk about the creatures. There's no point at which in this game where there is a codex or where there is a encyclopedia where you can just sit down and... There's no exposition moment. There's no... not Gandalf. The other Gandalf. Dumbledore. There's no Dumbledore moment in this game. Rather, what happens is you get 1,000 different tidbits of information, especially if you're paying attention. Which is, by the way, I'd really recommend if you are playing this game, play through it in one go, because it'll be easier to keep track of all this stuff. That's what I did. But as you're paying attention, you notice that all these pieces actually fit together properly. They didn't just randomly toss out flavor for fun's sake. They obviously, behind the scenes, actually laid out all this stuff in what effectively would be a codex, one cohesive chunk of information, and then started writing tidbits and flavor bits and dialogue for the narrator and all that stuff based on that, so it all fits together. And this is a brilliant... This is right up there with what Obsidian tends to do, and I was just praising that in my New Vegas stream very recently. This is right up there with what the greats do with regards to setting and world building. Is you would see this, all these puzzle pieces over time start to form this tapestry. And as you get further and further into the game, it becomes more and more apparent that this is more of a world that you're sitting in, that you're playing in, that you're playing through. Or, to be slightly more accurate in the Bastion's case, this was a world. And it is an amazing and incredibly well done. I have nothing but praise for their world building and their setting. So, based on everything else, ultimately story is actually above average because the setting really drags it up. But you get my point, right? So, I've explained the specifics of those two things. What I have not explained is the third point. I've been waiting to talk about this for forever. I've talked forever that there are two main aspects to gameplay, to a video game, as to whether or not that video game has quality. Gameplay, which is actually two things: the actual gameplay, what you're doing, leveling or shooting, or the actual controls and that kind of thing, and interface. The ease of the user interface, the smoothness of it, the appearance of it, everything that involves you interacting with the game. That also extends to controls for the most part. This is gameplay, and I just described story, right? I've been waiting forever for a game that I could show off the third aspect of a video game, because there are plenty of games that have this third aspect, but I wanted a really extreme example of this. This is probably the most extreme example I'm going to have for a while, especially having looked at my upcoming Ruminations list. So, gameplay, story, presentation. Presentation's the third one. I actually wanted to play a couple other games, which I will not mention because it will be, people will hate me and kill me with sticks again. But there are some games that, frankly, do not have particularly good gameplay, and frankly have actually bad story, and yet I still played them, and in some cases replayed them. Why? Because the presentation was amazing. Presentation is the hardest to define of the three. I can define the two aspects of gameplay and the five aspects of story very easily. Presentation is basically all... how exactly all of those elements are brought to you. How exactly they are presented to you. It comes down to art design and the actual art itself. It comes down to the sound design. A often undervalued aspect of video games. It comes down to not just the music itself, but the way the music is presented. It comes down to how the game is actually coded fundamentally in order to present these things contiguously to you. It comes down to how much effort was put into stringing things together so that they are logical and cohesive. It's a very much more vague, almost metaphysical way to describe the process by which the game reaches you. Bastion is one of the best presented games I've seen in a long time. And that's really where so much of my praise of this game comes to be. Even if the story was worse, if the plot was not existent and the characterization was not existent and the setting was still awesome, even if the gameplay was actually actively irritating, I would still have played this game because it was so well presented. The art design is phenomenal. I don't want to get too much into subtleties yet, because that's my second last big point. But the way that they would present ideas in purely visual format, the way that they would actually show the kind of area you're in with random sound effects and with the background images, which most people probably don't even notice. One of the oldest quotes that I learned a long time ago, when I first got into design in general, is, you're doing your job. This applies to a lot of things, editing, video production, art design, sound design, music, that kind of thing. You're doing your job well when nobody notices it. And that sounds kind of defeatist, but it's true. The best done of any of that stuff, which is all a part of presentation, is when it just naturally flows with the rest of whatever it is you're perceiving, in this case the rest of the game. And it's just there, and it highlights it, it adds to it. This may be just a piece of bread, but this piece of bread is on a really nice plate, and you're in a very comfortable room on a really comfortable chair, and there's a nice scent in the air of whatever it is you like. In my case, it would be my maple toddy candle, which I absolutely love. The temperature in the room is just right. The lighting is just right in the room. You've got a glass of insert your favorite drink here. Canada Dry. You got a Canada Dry right there. The bread is still bread, but the way this bread is being conveyed to you is so pleasant that you are going to enjoy it more. This ties back into something I've been talking about a lot lately, especially with regards to when I was going through the Mass Effect during the Mass Effect marathon. If overall there is enough good to outweigh the bad, because there is always bad, let's just re-stress that for the 50th time, then you are more likely to enjoy regardless of the bad, because the good outweighs it. And that's really what Bastion does in a nutshell. Now, I know there's going to be some people who disagree with me with this, and that's totally fine, and I'm okay with that, as I always am. But I still have nothing but praise for this game, because it's obvious that they took a game that would probably have been okay. It would have been interesting. It would have been mentally stimulating still, but it would not have been amazing. It would not have. This game does belong in the art category for me, to use a slightly less fanciful term, in the top 100, which is actually like 130 games, but whatever. This game definitely deserves to be that because it was so well presented. I don't even know how properly to put it. The narration is, of course, beyond amazing. I don't even know how best to put it. It's very obvious that this gentleman and the directors, the audio directors, the voice directors, who actually worked with him, really worked to craft every individual line to make them good. And if you're paying attention, most of his lines are basically one sentence. And that's an amazing tool when it comes to programming, because it means you can pick and put sentences here and there in order to have it flow more naturally with the events that are happening in the game, and make it easier to fit with pseudo cutscenes, aka cutscenes that aren't pre-rendered, cutscenes that you're actually seeing as you're playing through the game. It was just so well presented. I'm sorry for refreshing that, but God Almighty, it was amazing. So okay, we're back. So I wrote down a note here which is called the Mario Sunshine effect. I know, people hate me, and people will hate me for comparing this game to Mario Sunshine. Bastion equals Mario Sunshine. There we go, just to make it easier for you guys who want to hate me for this. But Mario Sunshine, one of the things I actually liked most about it was getting rid of all the goop in a stage and an area. Usually I'd only do it once, because, you go through multiple times as per the Mario 64 standard. But I enjoyed doing that. Like, it was actually fun. It wasn't an OCD thing. It didn't bug me. It was just, yeah, no, this is cool, and make it all nice and shiny. And the funny thing is, in Mario Sunshine, they had little things to make that more interesting. They had the characters go, yeah, when you got them free, and you'd have the area go, whoosh, and there'd be like a little shine of sparkles. They didn't have to do that stuff, but they did. It gives you zero benefit, other than the spots you have to do for the plotline. It gives you no benefit at all. But it was still a nice little touch to make it fun, and that's exactly what Bastion does. As you're roaming around, the world forming up around you and making more of this place is effectively completely pointless. I mean, it's ridiculously easy to get the memorial for raising, I think it's 13,000 pieces of land or something like that. I did that without even trying. I did that before I even hit, the third to last stage. But my point I'm trying to reach here is that it was just fun. It was interesting. I liked actually exploring just to see what pieces of the land would arise and form here. And sometimes it would be simple little things. Sometimes it would be things that would be interesting. Sometimes it would be like, oh, well, this led off this direction. It was just cool, and I liked that. Now, so let's also talk about... how do I put this? Wait, what? Oh, right. God. Okay, so let's also talk about the who knows where's segments. There's 4 of them, I do believe, one for each of the characters, where you get to learn something about their backstories, except for Rusk. You learn basically nothing about him during his. It's actually kind of horrible and tragic because each one of these shares some really horrible facts about their history. The kid... yeah. I mean, I guess I'll just summarize. The kid's father died young, or was gone, or whatever. And then, in order to take care of his mother, he volunteered for service on the wall, which is, rough, brutal, constant hard work in military service for all intents and purposes. Came back and found out his mother was dead, and then went back to the wall because, why not? What else is there for him? He had a pretty rough, unaccepted life. And I'm not going to go into the rest of them. I don't want to go over all of them. But the point being, we learn a huge amount about the histories of these characters and why they act the way they do during these sequences. The one that really struck me was Zulf's, because it felt like they were going to go in one of the very obvious things they could do. He was there with the Ura, and, he learned about how the Ura had changed and don't want war with the Caelondians. So he goes to Caelondia, and he starts to preach, peace, and then he meets his wife, and then, his wife-to-be, and my first thought was, oh god, this is going to end terribly. And it did, but not the way I was expecting. I was expecting we were going to hear about how horrible Caelondians were, or something horrible had happened to her, or whatever. No, instead what actually is he woke up and the calamity hit. Like a fate, a ton of bricks to the face. Now, naturally, that is still Caelondia's fault, as we learn throughout the course of the game, but point remaining. My point, though, that I really want to make here is, as I was going through those sequences, I wasn't actually motivated by the coins, rupees, bits, I don't even know what they're actually called in the game, the currency, the red orbs that you could spend on upgrades and stuff. That was zero motivation to me. I already had what I wanted, and all of it was pretty much fully upgraded. And I kept doing it because I really wanted to hear what happened next. And it would get to the point where I would get to like 3 or so left, and you start getting into the really hard battles, because it's just an escalating arena, basically. And each wave you defeat gets you one more snippet of backstory about that character. Now, that itself says a lot about the game design motivations of this group and what exactly we're going for. They also motivated you by giving you the currency, so that's good. The people who don't care about the story are getting the currency so they can enjoy their game better. But for people like me, we are getting what we actually care about. We are getting more content. We are getting more of this game, more of this story, more of this setting, more of these characters, more of the backstory. And it was genuinely motivating. I got to the point where I was actually nervous. I really wanted to avoid dying because, and I'm really dodging all over the place and doing the best I can on some of those fights when it's, multiple of the big bosses at the same time. Because, damn it, I have to find out what happens next. I really want to know what the next tidbit is. It was one of the most motivating things I've seen in a game like that in a long time, so definite props there. By the way, I found out after I beat the game a second time that you can die and you get another chance to basically a continue. I didn't know that. This is not bragging, but I didn't actually die during my playthrough of Bastion because I basically thought you couldn't. I knew you could fall off and you just lose health, but I did my damnedest to never actually die, and I had all sorts. My loadout was basically health, health potions, a chance to live if you're at one health, all that stuff, because I was deathly afraid of losing my progress. I'm an idiot. What do you want from me? Speaking of that same kind of concept, though, then there's the dream sequence. Now, the dream sequence is great because at first you don't realize what's going on. Obviously, it's some kind of weird sequence, and the narrator's still narrating it. Except he isn't. We aren't actually hearing the narrator. If you really pay attention, it's obvious early on, but it becomes incredibly obvious the further you go into the dream sequence that all you're hearing is various voice samples and voice clips strung together, sometimes completely out of order, that have already happened previous to this point in the game. In other words, what is literally happening, again, this is that presentation thing, what is literally happening is as we're going through these random areas that are parts of the kid's memory, we are hearing random tidbits, we, the player, are hearing random tidbits of what the narrator said previously to indicate that we are going through those previous sections, that we're just, in our own mind kind of a thing. Brilliantly done. One other final subtlety to that I loved, I mentioned that visual design, especially with regards to the background, which I'll be talking more about in a moment. If you paid attention, this is not very subtle, but it's a nice little touch. There's these little pollen seeds kind of going around in the background, and that immediately evoked within me the idea that we were in this haze, this coma, sleep-induced kind of a situation because of the pollen of the plant that we had inhaled while we were in the wilds. And it was just a nice little touch to have that little visual reminder of what was going on. Very well done. Very well done. Okay. So, let's talk about the kid and Zulf and Zia and Rusk. Actually, we're going to do a brief discussion about a concept, and then we're going to lead into a few things that relate to it. And that is the idea that this game is heavily based on interpretation. Not as much as I originally thought. And that's what I actually want to start with. The very first time I played Bastion, billions and billions of years ago, when the Earth was still cooling, I thought this was going to be a purely metaphysical game, and that irritated me. It's nothing really personal, it's nothing like, I hate those kind of games. Well, I kind of do. I don't want to say that all games that try to be, I don't mean this as an insult, artsy. I don't mean that all games that try to be metaphysical, significant, analogous, metaphorical, etc. are bad. What I do mean is that I can't stand things like that. In terms of game, in terms of books, in terms of movie, in terms of music, in terms of television, I am a very literal kind of a person. If you paid attention to any of my discussions about any of my writings ever, everything that happens is pretty literal. Everything that happens has an explanation. Everything that happens actually happens. Now, I like the occasional meta thing, especially if it's done well, but you get where I'm going with, right? So when I very first played Bastion, I immediately put it right back down again because I thought, oh god, this is just going to be one of those kind of a things. I was, of course, completely wrong about that. This game is actually very literal, all things considered, by my interpretation. It wasn't until I got a lot further in the game and as I was really thinking about it that I started realizing that the game may or may not be literal. That I started to realize that the game may or may not have actually happened the way it happened. It may or may not actually function the way I thought it functioned, because many, many aspects of the game are up to the player to interpret in their own right. For example, let's toss one thing right at you here. Do you think, why do you think that the calamity, I keep wanting to call it the cataclysm, Deathwing flying overhead, why do you think the calamity spared these individuals? Now, a lot of Ura was spared, a huge amount, actually. But why in Caelondia were only 4 people spared? There's a lot of answers to that, and I don't think any of them is really more correct than the other. If you asked me, my opinion, I would say these are 4 people that have the capacity to endure, and that the calamity was a semi-magical, semi-technological thing. Yes, I know that we'll get to that one in a second. But my point is, but the way the calamity worked, there's a lot of sense of it actually knowing what to do on its own. You know, it being able to make up its own mind about how it destroys and what it destroys, which is why some places survive better than others. Some places require stones to survive, blah, 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 right? So the idea being that it didn't destroy these 4 people like it did everyone else because they already had endured such tragedy, such horror, such hardships in their lives. And all 4 of them were therefore capable of literally enduring the calamity, which is admittedly a little metaphysical. But at the same time, it's actually quite linear when you really think about it, very coherent. Now, there's a lot of interpretations of that. I've actually heard several. One of the ones I heard recently is that it was literally dumb luck. Pure random luck that these 4 people lived. One of the things I heard was that it was maybe about their physical locations. Rusk was at the Bastion, Zia was in the mines, and Zulf was in this way. The point being that there was something about their physical locations that protected them. I've heard a theory that it was doing this deliberately because it was trying to ensure that people who could actually change the future and would not repeat the mistakes of the past would be the ones to survive. I've heard the theory that it was forced to choose those 4 people because that's who it chose last time. Paradoxal, in other words, or paradoxical, excuse me. Spoiler alert, by the way. You get the idea. There's a lot of ways to interpret that. My throat's actually giving out on me. I'm going to try and finish before I lose my voice entirely here. The other thing you can really interpret is the literal or metaphysical nature of how much of the world was actually destroyed. Now, you may be looking at me kind of weird by that. But let's think about what we actually know. We know that they are up in the sky to some extent or another. That's pretty much proven. We know that some of the land forms around you, and it kind of grows up around you. We know that if certain things happen, if certain conditions are met, that land will then crumble back down to the ground. What we also know is we can see something in the background. That's really where things get tricky for me, because there's 3 major ways to interpret this, with a lot of variances in between them. The main things you could think here of: A, the very concept of how reality works was altered by the calamity, so they weren't on a planet anymore, or a world, or a land, or whatever, a dimension, a plane. Instead, they were now on something new, which operated under different rules. And so while there may be imagery in the background of what could be, or should be, or might be, that is literally just an image and not actually there. And what they are on now is all that's left, at least in this area, because we also know, again, the calamity didn't affect everywhere equally. So, second major interpretation is they are literally just in the sky, and most of what was Caelondia and chunks of the wilds and chunks of Ura were literally ripped up out of the ground and forced up here. And this land was being maintained by the stones, by the magic or technology or whatever they're in, and as it was crumbled or reduced or repaired or whatever, it then interacted to the point where some of it fell back to the ground in ruins and so forth. One of the variances here being that what's left down on the actual ground down there is in utter ruins, to the point where it's not even worth thinking about. One of the popular theories is that it is literally just ash down there, nothing but ash. For the record, that is my personal interpretation of events. However, then there's the final thought, that they are literally walking in what is effectively space for all intents and purposes. There is nothing below them. If they fall for infinity. They die of starvation. And they're effectively in what you could call a new pocket dimension. I shouldn't say pocket dimension, but in a new dimension for all intents and purposes, that functions differently. Now that may sound similar to the first thing, but the difference is in this case, they're only being maintained by the magic / technology of the Bastion and the stones and all that fun stuff. So they still have a literal physical substance. They are not in a metaphysical realm, which is the difference there. And then there's one last thing. There's actually a lot of things that are up to interpretation, but I'm going to cover one more. And that is the fact that the word magic is never actually used, literally or otherwise, throughout the course of this game. It is implied that either these people are quite technologically advanced, or magitechnologically advanced, or magically advanced. And which of the three it is, or indeed a blending thereof, which arguably is just the middle one, is up to interpretation of the player. For reference, I personally think that this was a magitechnological situation, that they had significant technology and they used it in conjunction with magical capacities, blah, 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 mostly fueled by the windbags. Now, one last note here before I get into the big thing here. And that is that if you're paying attention, there are basically 2 voice actors in this game. That's almost a spoiler, because throughout the huge chunk of the game, you just hear the narrator over and over and over and over and over, describing everything. What is actually happening, and there's actually a lot of hints to this, and it's especially apparent on a New Game Plus, but what is happening is he is describing the events of the game to Zia as they await the kids' return from the Ura lands in order to figure out what's going to happen. Because all they have to do is just sit around and wait and talk while they await their fate, which is appropriate. I guess there's one last thing I want to talk about. Whatever. Point I'm trying to get across here, though, is that the addition of a voice actress for Zia right at the end helped punctuate that scene and really get across the significance of it. And I like the idea of adding one other voice actor instead of suddenly voice acting everyone. It added a nice emphasis, a punctuation to the scene, and really helped to stress just how important this choice is that you're about to make with regards to the ending. Now, I missed over this, but this is very important for me to talk about because this leads into the final thing, the theme, the big theme. One last thing. Yeah, I'm losing my voice. One last thing that is significant with regards to player interpretation. Why is it, if you rescued Zulf and carried him on your back, why is it that the Ura stopped attacking you? Now, we don't actually know why. I actually looked this one up a little bit, and I found out that the most common, to the point of almost absolution, answer to that was respect. That they had respect for him and for what he was doing. I find that interesting because that was not my first thought at all. I'll share my first thought last because it's actually what I think really happened. But as I've sat thinking about it, and I talked about it with Pax, who's also played this, we came up with a few interpretations of how this worked. There's the obvious, they respect you for all you've done, for all the work you've done. They consider you a worthy enemy, right? Second, they are tired of fighting. They're tired of the war, they're tired of the conflict, and as they perceive you, a Ceylondian, helping an Ura, both of you injured, they realize the stupidity of continuing to fight and are willing to embrace peace, right? Next option. Next option's... we'll just skip over this one, because it's actually really hard to explain and kind of meta. But it has to do with the idea of basically... How do I put this? Of having the concept of... he's not worth it, I guess is probably the best way I could put it. That you and Zulf are no longer worth it. You were literally not worth their arrows, and therefore not worth them bothering to finish off. Now we'll go to the last one, which is my personal take on things. And this is a very strong thing, and this is why this leads into the theme. The idea of futility. One of the I keep playing these depressing games. One of the things that was very strong as a theme throughout the Bastion is how desperate the situation really is and how bad things really are. And it emphasizes it in very quiet ways, very subtle ways. There's a million subtle little things. I wrote down a couple subtleties here. Zora's singing and the song and the significance of that song and the fact that it actually foreshadows things we don't even know yet about the Ura versus the Ceylondians. The narration directly foreshadowing some of the things that were going to happen. The way in which certain I mentioned the background, I mentioned the uses of the art design and the sound design. There are a trillion subtleties in this game, but all of them build the portrait that this is a dead world. Not dying, dead. That there is no point in anything anymore because it's all ruins. Right? So the very strong impression I got is that they stopped firing on you because there was no point in bothering. Because at that point they realized that all their hatred and all their fighting and all their vengeance and all their desire for righteous justice and for rebuilding their nation, and it was all meaningless. And that's really the strongest implication I got from that. And that's part of why I like the theme of the game so much. Because the theme of the game, I could summarize it as hope, but that is too general, and you know me. So let's go ahead and really go into what the theme of the game really is. The theme of the game is making new out of old. Now that may sound like a generic thing, just like the word hope does, but it's very significant because it is applied without condition. Doesn't matter how damaged the old is. Doesn't matter how battered it is. Doesn't matter how lost it is. Doesn't matter how broken. It doesn't matter how much was ripped from you, from your soul, from your heart, from your mind, from your body. Because you can still use what is left in order to make something new. You can still try. The ultimate theme of the game is that it is not futile to go on. And I liked that. And it is so beautifully shown by the endings. You could argue that the New Game Plus ending, because let's be honest, that's what it is exactly that. My first playthrough, I had no difficulty choosing at all because he says it right there. All the Bastion does is rewinds time to a certain point in time. No alterations. From even a basic understanding of how time may work, obviously this is the realm of fiction, that means the exact same thing will happen again because that's what happened last time. You follow? And obviously that is confirmed by the New Game Plus mode. So it was an easy answer for me to choose evacuation. But the evacuation itself was the idea that there is something more, that we can take what we have built, we can take what is left, and try to make something new of it. And the ending really had that strong feel of it. And it had one of the most beautifully subtle ways to present that, again, getting to my earlier point, that I've ever seen. Throughout the course of this game, there are two songs that play. I don't know the name of them, forgive me. But one has to do with a wall, it's sung by Zia, and one has to do with your mother and all that. That's sung... Well, I assume that's sung by the kid. I'm not 100% sure on that. Both songs are very depressing, very melancholy, very morose. At the ending, they're played at the same time in a certain cadence with each other so that the words overlap in some cases and they match each other in other cases. And if you're really paying attention, the meaning changes. You take the old and you make something new out of it. And all of a sudden, that song about bringing down that wall and that song about losing your mother or being holed up and being incapable of doing things, those two songs combined suddenly mean something hopeful, some kind of possibility for the future. I was blown away by that. I was actually literally in awe of the amazing, how much work and obvious care and effort was put onto that. One of the things that I used to praise about the older Final Fantasies was that it was so obvious that the developers cared about making a great game. Not just making a game, not just making a paycheck, but they wanted to put out something amazing. And that is what the Bastion is. and I hope you enjoyed it just as much as I did. Kid turns to the side, forgets to turn off his microphone. No, none of that.